I recently had the pleasure of interviewing Scott Horton. He's the managing director of the Libertarian Institute, the editorial director for antiwar.com, and host of The Scott Horton Show. He's conducted over 5,000 interviews of various libertarians and other non-interventionists, and is the author of Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and The Great Ron Paul, which is the product of interviews with Ron Paul between 2004 and 2019. So without further ado, enjoy the interview. Hey Scott, so I really appreciate the time that you're taking to talk with me today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So when we talk about people who have affected entire generations, it's hard to look at the realm of politics and see anyone in recent times that has had a comparable effect to that of Ron Paul. So I guess the place to start, especially for people who might not know a lot about Ron Paul, is to get an idea of exactly what stood out about him to you that made you want to write a book about him.
Sure. Sorry. Well, my first, I guess you could call it Giuliani moment with Ron Paul was 10 years before his argument with Giuliani. It was when he first came back to Congress in 1997. And I'd heard him on the radio during the campaign of 96, but he had seemed somewhat interesting, but I didn't know where to follow up or anything, didn't know anything about it. But I saw him, the way I remember it anyway, was it was the middle of the night C-SPAN reruns. And he was speaking essentially to an empty house. And he was saying, Mr. Speaker, I have here in my hands a printout of some stories that came out in the British press today about how President Bush was selling chemical weapons and other weapons to Saddam Hussein right up until the time that the war began. And I thought, wow, I can't believe what I'm seeing, that any congressman would be brave enough to say that about the Bush Senior administration, you know? And then I look at the bottom of the screen and it says Ron Paul, R, Texas. And I thought, no way. A Republican, I mean, most people know that Bush Senior's not really a Texan, but he did make his fortune here. He was a nominal Texan for many years. He was a senator from Texas. And, you know, obviously the Bush family is very influential in the Republican Party in this state. And for a Republican member of Congress to say something like that, which equated to, unlike what we've been going through recently, a genuine accusation of essentially treason, although Ron didn't use that kind of language at the time. But that was just so brave. And it was shortly after that he made some headlines for saying, well, I don't know, I think my constituents are more worried about being bombed like what happened to the Branch Davidians at Waco than they are worried about being bombed by, you know, an anti-government terrorist in response to something like that. And he got in all kinds of trouble for saying that. You're not supposed to say that they bombed the Branch Davidians, even though in fact they did bomb them, not just set their house on fire, but bomb them as they killed them. The Army Delta Force did. But anyway, it was stuff like that back then where I just thought, hey, man, here's a guy who he says whatever he wants no matter what. And he's not trying to be a provocateur, right? He wasn't like, you know, James Trafficant saying, beam me up, Scotty, and just being, you know, kind of provocative in that way. But he, you know, was just, he'll never back down on anything. And that was the famous Giuliani moment that came in 2007, was Giuliani demanded that he recant, that how dare he say that the terrorists had any motive centered around American government's actions in the Middle East, that no, everybody knows they just hate freedom and this kind of thing. And he absolutely refused to back down one bit. He just said, the CIA calls it blowback. He didn't even say sorry. He didn't say, sorry, you feel that way, or any kind of thing. He just said, the CIA came up with the term blowback. It means consequences from the things the CIA does, okay? And this kind of deal. And man, and of course, in that moment, that was the rest of America's Giuliani moment. And he got millions and millions and millions of supporters out of that, where people just were shocked, but pleased to hear a politician respect them enough to just tell them the truth. You know what? I think he's right that the 1990s did exist, and that Bill Clinton wasn't so much a pacifist hippie like they portrayed him from the right. He really did bomb Iraq every 3 days for 8 years straight. And you could see how it does kind of make sense that some Egyptians and Saudis might team up to attack America to avenge the Iraqis being bombed from bases in Saudi Arabia, where the radicals certainly didn't want them in the first place. And so people said, you know what? Nobody ever says that. Oh, they hate our freedom. And here, Ron Paul, it's a bitter pill he's serving up, you got to admit. And they swallowed it because they could tell that he was being truthful. And that he just thought that they deserved to know and needed to know. And that's the same Ron Paul that I respect so much, you know?
Yeah, it's like they say the best salesman is the salesman who might not know the best techniques, but he's the one who really believes in the product. And
That's
to
right.
see that kind of passion from Ron Paul, I mean, especially during 2008 and 2012, that whole election cycle. But I listened to an interview, or actually it was a speech that he gave recently. And he said that people were saying, oh, Congressman Paul, you're, back when he was a congressman, you know, Congressman Paul, you're the best congressman we've ever had. And he's like, well, the competition's not that hard. But personally, for me, I think that the largest influence that Ron Paul had on me stemmed from his criticisms of the Federal Reserve and more broadly the central banking system, because he opened my eyes to fractional reserve banking and how it's not really a coincidence that the era of central banking coincides with the era of global war.
That's right. Well, and listen, I mean, I think it's a great segue, right? We couldn't have a world empire if they just had to raise our taxes to pay for the thing. They have to be able to borrow it from China. They have to be able to monetize debt and play games with the books, essentially, to continually kick the can down the road to make the war feel essentially free to the American people. Because if it's too much of a hardship, people will buck. So it's required. But then here's the real consequence of that, because you can complain, and you are right, that inflation is theft, that it's bad for the government to rig the interest rate in a way that hurts grandma and her savings account just to benefit a bunch of rich Wall Street traders. That's not fair, but that's nothing compared to the real problem. And that is the boom and the bust cycle. Again, when a huge motive of the whole thing is just to make the war seem like it's not costing you. But what happens is, instead of getting inflation across the board, we have massive inflation in certain sectors. And that's why we see, just like at the end of the 1990s in the Bill Clinton era, we saw a massive crash. And at the end of, coming up on the end of Bush's term in 2008, we saw that crash again. Well, that's essentially all the pain and suffering that people go through as all those bad debts are cleared and all those businesses fall apart and all those families fall apart and all of the horrible social consequences. That's your price for killing all those Iraqis. That's what it costs you. They made it seem free at first, but it really wasn't. It costs that much. And so that's the price you pay later on. And then this is the real consequence for the American people, who, after all, aren't really in danger of terrorism. Even if there was a massive attack tomorrow, I wouldn't really have to eat crow about that, because statistically speaking, the few attacks that our government's policy does generate against us don't threaten any of us on any given day in any real way. But what we have to pay is a terrible social cost of having at least the lower half of the economic ladder, but really more than that, suffer these terrible losses and dislocations from the boom bust cycle. And that's the kind of thing where, as libertarians, it's one of the most powerful tools that we have to teach people about liberty and real economics and whatever, because everybody knows that the economy crashes every 10 or 12 years. Nobody knows why, but we all know it does. I heard it's the excesses of capitalism, maybe something like that. But then a libertarian explains that, listen, you don't have to agree with us about any other thing. You just have to understand the libertarians are the ones who figured this out, especially, Ludwig von Mises and the people who came after him. They're the ones who explain the cause of the business cycle. It's not really the business cycle at all. It's the government inflationary money bubble cycle. And it's all wrapped up, as you say, in the warfare state. And again, to the greatness of Ron Paul is because he is a true libertarian. He has the unified field theory of liberty. He understands natural rights. He understands anti-imperialism in a serious way, not in some kind of sort of compromised conservative way, but in a way that is rooted in an understanding of what it means to have a constitutional republic. instead of an empire, its worst adversary and enemy. And of course, he understands and is a teacher of Austrian school economics, aka economics, right? And he's just a decent, caring old country doctor who you can tell really means what he says. His voting record while he was in Congress proved it, and he consistently, essentially, is sticking up for all people who are oppressed by the state at every opportunity. And I guess one more thing, as long as I'm rambling, is you watch Ron Paul's show with Dan McAdams, 4 days a week. Those guys, all they care about is war. And then on Fridays, he does gold and the markets and money with Chris Rossini. Mr. Old Gold Bug, all he really cares about is fighting against the warfare state. And then you can tell gold is the afterthought. No offense to Chris. They do a great job. And Ron is great on economics. But him and Dan McAdams are two of the most effective anti-war people in our society. And, have been for a very long time. And both of them are right about everything every time because they know what they're talking about. They really do the work and know what they're talking about. And you can just see his priority. The guy's 84 years old or something like that. He could be just sitting and enjoying his great-grandchildren and drinking iced tea right now. And instead, every single day, gets up and goes to work and says, hey, Dan, which war are we opposing today? Bam, and they knock it out. Every single day,
Well, that's why I think it's so funny that people keep buying into
And the gold, again, is important, too. But that just goes to show who he really is and what he's really about,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's funny how long the American people have had the veil over their eyes where, Jerome Powell talks about constant 2% inflation, like that's supposed to be normal, like that's the sign of a healthy economy. But
right.
I mean,
well, and of course what happens is too when and I remember this from Alan Greenspan back in the day, and sometimes when he was arguing with Ron Paul in front of the committee, but just at other times too in his testimony. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, that whenever widespread price inflation starts kicking up a little bit, instead of just in the bubble sectors, but sort of in a widespread way, what they always do is they blame the people who are on the lowest end of the economic chain, the wage earners and the lower, or medium skilled or unskilled wage earners. And they say, oh, see, there's a beginning to be upward pressure on wages, and that's causing inflation. So now the people who are the very last ones to get a cost of living increase and adjustment to keep up with the price of money dropping, the value of money dropping, and the increased cost of living, they end up getting blamed for causing inflation. Uh-oh, the economy's overheating. The working man is demanding that he get a quarter raise because and we can't have that. We got to blame it all on him. And now we got to raise the interest rates before people start thinking that they can ask their boss for a raise. We got to always make sure that it's a hirer's market and never a laborer's. I mean, that's pretty damn mean when you consider there's nothing like a free market here, right? It's either a right-wing socialist or a left-wing socialist economy, and this is just the government taking the side of the owners versus their employees in a brutal fashion, and they're totally shameless about it. I mean, Alan Greenspan, I remember him saying that in front of the Congress, like, oh no, upward pressure on wages, that could cause inflation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, says the guy in charge of the money machine, sitting on top of a money machine with his pedal to the metal as he says it,
Oh, yeah. I mean, when you have a fiat currency with constant inflation, it just makes a debt-based economy. And in terms of our current cultural state, too, the West as a whole seems to be robbed of its significance, you could say, by people who could be broadly spoken of as cowards of reality. I mean, people who love their just numbing falsehoods. But going even deeper than that, it's a love for this idealism in their head. I mean, we're indulging in values completely opposed to our self-interest, and we're seeing the culmination of a culture that has traded a fear of internal guilt for a love of imposing responsibility on other people. And this right here is a key step on the road to an empire, because people must cast themselves as morally righteous, and only then does it make absolute sense to push your values by force. the individual becomes indebted to the society at birth, oddly similar to the idea of original sin. And this tribalism fuels government expansion. I mean, look at the push for democracy by Western nations. To think that it works, you have to think that you can change an entire culture by man-made force and that you're justified in doing it. Now, Western culture is primed for it, and the central banks, like we were saying, open the door for endless military intervention, and we treat the government as the forceful purveyor of morality. And of course, there's much more to it all, but do you see this cultural degradation as sprouting from a people that have strayed from the free market nature? Or, well, rather in a more specific case, do you think that privatizing defense would reduce the needless global conflicts, the wasteful spending, and the propagandistic element? Or do you see another solution that might be considered less radical but still achieve the same end goal?
That's an interesting question. Oh, I have to admit to you that you cut out there for about 10 or 15 seconds. So I wasn't able to hear all of your question, but I'm pretty sure I got the gist of all that. And I think, yeah, as far as, yes, I think anarcho-capitalism essentially, well, look at the situation we have now, right? We have, for example, I guess this is the easiest example. You have Dick Cheney, who was the CEO of Halliburton, and not a very good one in the 1990s. And he had been the Secretary of Defense before, and that was why he was hired. The idea was, well, he's got good connections with the military and the government, and he'd been the Secretary of Defense, and so we'll make some money. But he hadn't really done that well for Halliburton. Then when he becomes president, he has essentially the entire national government at his fingertips, and he can socialize the costs of everything he wants to do for Halliburton onto the American people at large through taxes and debt and inflation, as we talked about, and send the Marine Corps and the Army on an errand for which they will need assistance by Halliburton, and they get a bunch of no-bid contracts to build military bases and provide other services for the Army and essentially charge whatever they want for it. And so he can do them that large favor. Now, those kind of economics are, it's the combination of, the public authority to tax and socialize all of the income and the revenue to provide for this, while privatizing all of the profits for the chosen politically connected few. And so that is really a major part of our problem, and has been essentially, I think, since World War I, but especially since World War II, what Ike Eisenhower, who had been the supreme Allied commander of United Nations forces in Europe, called the military-industrial complex. And that is just the political and economic relationship, no conspiracy or secret society behind it or whatever, just the political and economic relationship between the people who manufacture the arms for the government, the congressmen who appropriate the money for the purchases, and the military officials who, of course, do a lot of the deciding about what weapons they want and from which company and all these kinds of things. And these men end up working together and forming sort of their own new separate institution, the military-industrial complex, this iron triangle. And it distorts our entire economy toward warfare. So the opposite of that, I guess, and it's more of a thought experiment than anything else. I don't know how to tell you to get from here to there or anything, but the opposite of that would be, if you want to fight a war, you go fight it. And even if you're the head of whatever corporation, that whatever you get elected the vice president of, you don't have a Marine Corps to socialize the costs of onto the populace at large and to exploit for your own purposes. And I don't mean to reduce the entire Iraq war to just that, by the way, but I'm saying that was the Halliburton role in the whole drama, if you see what I mean there. But so the opposite of that is essentially, to privatize national defense in a way. In other words, to forbid the power of the Congress to tax people and raise armies. If you want to fight, form a local militia and keep whatever invader at bay. And that should be the way it is. And that way, if left-leaning anarchists or communists want to go and fight in the Spanish Civil War, go right ahead. You want to go join up with John Brennan's Al-Qaeda legions in Syria? Just fine. Just don't do it on my dime. John Brennan, if he wants to go lead Al-Qaeda in Syria, he should resign from CIA and go and fight in Syria his own self without being able to force the rest of us to go along with it. So that's kind of a dream, but it does illustrate the point that Who needs a foreign policy where America takes the side of Al-Qaeda in Syria? That doesn't sound like the kind of thing the American people chose at large. You can, drum up a campaign, and there's certainly truth in it, about what a terrible, violent leader Bashar al-Assad is. But nobody ever was, in mass media or in government was honest with the American people at large about who Assad's opponents are. They're Al-Qaeda fighters, loyal, blood oath loyal to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the butcher in New York City. So, instead they're moderate rebels. They're moderate rebels. But again, that's because there's a government program to defend. There's a project that they're all on. Where on the other hand, if you just want to take your life savings and go and fight wherever, that's fine, as long as you leave the rest of us out of it. And you don't see too much of that, do you? How many American right-wingers who cheer the attempted coup in Venezuela and the successful coup in Bolivia, how many of them would go in there and participate in the coup themselves and spend their own money and risk their own lives overthrowing somebody else's leader? Nah, but they'll cheer when the CIA does it. And so that's what we should stop socializing the costs of their projects, whether it's liberal or conservative people in power here, Republicans or Democrats, whatever they're up to. Obama and Hillary backed a right-wing coup in Honduras. Makes no difference. And they don't have the right to do that. And that's, the first thing is that's the consensus that we need to really come upon here, is that we just don't have the right. I think what you're getting at there was talking about how it reminds me of a George Carlin bit that I heard from about 1980, where he was talking about the big jazzercise fad and how everyone was wearing leg warmers and doing all these exercises and stuff. And he was saying, yeah, you lost your soul in Vietnam, and so now you're trying to build your body up to make up for it, but it's never going to work, pal. And this kind of thing. And because people are in, I think, as you're saying, they're in denial. And what better way to show how good you are than to start a fight to make somebody else be just like you? You must be really great, or else why would you do something like that? I guess is the thinking. And so why clean our own house when we can, turn someone else's upside down? And so we continue on.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this socialization of the military, I mean, it basically takes businesses, and once they get involved with the military-industrial complex, they lose their business sense. And it just allows them to continue acting in ways that are wholly unsustainable and in many ways very, very wasteful. But when I think about the 2008 and 2012 election, I mean, especially Ron Paul's influence in that, I think that the main reason that the American public wasn't ready for Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012, and I think, honestly, they're even less ready for him now, is because he was seen as such a radical at the time. I mean, he has that famous quote where he says that when he says that he wants to cut taxes, he doesn't just mean he wants to fiddle with the tax code. He wants to abolish the IRS and the income tax and replace them with nothing. And that's a radical idea for the average person. But this is an example of how the frame that people are
heaven forfend.
Yeah. But I mean, the frame that the American public is thinking in, it's not even a decent starting point. Like, what's truly radical is giving a small group of people the ability to control the affairs of the nation. This is why the deep state is even a thing. When you have a structure that's a magnet for vain, power-hungry people, you can't be surprised when those people exploit every ounce of power that they're given. It's why they try to terrify people of alternative rule. And in 2008 and 2012, Ron Paul was that terrifying other. It's why the government can wield force against peaceful people, and we barely bat an eye anymore. I mean, in all that you've come to learn and experience with Ron Paul and the Libertarian movement, what do you see as being a realistic way to begin making the baby steps to turn people towards a more free market mindset?
Well, there's a lot of things. I mean, I know what Ron would say, which is just you keep teaching people about liberty, and you don't know what comes next, and you don't know who's listening, and how things are. And in fact, the first time I interviewed him, he said, listen, a few years ago, well, this was in 2004, but he said, back in 1987, 86, 87, we all thought the Soviet Union would fall someday. But we had no idea that it would absolutely cease to exist within 2 or 3 years. It was unimaginable. And so it's not really our job to, predict the bad things, or just focus on the bad things. We got to explain to people about freedom and why it works and why it's really the best way, and go forward on that basis. And then so that's the part you're responsible for, and then hope that you're moving the margin in an effective way. And because after all, you can't trick people into being free. You're not going to somehow like deceive someone into electing people who love liberty into office or anything like that. They've got to be persuaded that actually, you know what? I hate the IRS too. Why? The sooner we get rid of that thing, the better, of course. And why do we need it anyway? If it's really just to dominate everyone else's part of the world, then maybe we should get rid of that first. And then we could get rid of the dominance second, or whatever it takes to do that. I think the real problem with Ron, I mean, obviously that power was going to do everything they could to keep him out. But as far as the American people were concerned, he was just a little bit too soon for the right. I mean, if you look at 2008, the American people elected Barack Obama. Overall, he won the center vote and the swing vote, and soundly defeated John McCain. And he represented, in a very superficial way, an opposite reaction to George W. Bush. It was not just the liberals and the left, but it was the American people sort of saying, hey, sorry for that, and re-electing him too. And that, so here's a liberal black guy from Illinois who's a Democrat and superficially speaking is different than Bush in every way. Now here comes Ron Paul, and again, superficially, he looks exactly like George W. Bush. He's an old white guy from Texas, an old white Protestant, Republican, conservative politician from Texas. And so the fact that you have to listen close to see that actually Barack Obama is just like George W. Bush, and Ron Paul is his opposite. So for liberals who should have supported Ron for what he really cared about, that was most important, like the anti-war stuff, they were too caught up in Obama mania. And then, but for right-wingers who heard what Ron Paul was saying, that he was running essentially, he didn't put it this way, but position-wise, he was running essentially as a direct repudiation to the president, who at that time was still in office and on his way out of office from their same party. And so it would have been like the Republicans not, it was just too soon. And then, of course, I love the paradox of this, right? Is that on one hand, Ron Paul could never be president. They had done anything they had to do to keep him from winning. And in fact, they really did rig Iowa and some of the other states, Nevada and some of the other states. There's a book about this called Swindled, about how they really did rip him off. I forget about New Hampshire and all the specifics, and I'm not certain he would have won, but he might have if they hadn't ripped him off in the first few states there where it really counted. And they had to give him a real fair shake in the media after that of some kind, at least in terms of time. Maybe it really could have been. But the thing of it is this, though, is there are 330 million Americans. So there's just no question that it could have been him. If it could have been Donald Trump, that means that the form of the electoral system in America is such that the centrist establishment does not always win. Not necessarily anyway. Donald Trump is, of course, the huge exception to the Bush-Clinton rule here. They were trying to go for another Bush or a Clinton. It's amazing. But anyway, I think that the reality is that if Americans by the tens of millions had said, hey, let's all vote in the Republican primaries and make sure this peace candidate who's not like Michael Moore, who's not asking you to be some, leftist, communist, millionaire, gluttonous, hypocrite, freako in order to be anti-war. But he's telling you, you can, if you like your personality, you can keep it. You can be exactly who you are, and you just don't have to believe in this stuff anymore. If that was what the American people really wanted to hear, and they were really ready to support that, they absolutely could have come together the way so many of us did. The rest of everyone could have joined us to make him the president and to see to it that, and unlike Donald Trump, Ron Paul knows how to read. And so there wouldn't have been any question that he would know who to hire. He would be able to pick carefully from all of his favorite writers of who he wanted to sit in his administration to help him implement that policy. And unlike Donald Trump, who's like, well, I don't know, Sheldon Adelson wants me to hire John Bolton. I guess I'll hire John Bolton. And, then finds himself in hot water over crises Bolton created, of course. But so, yeah, it couldn't have been. And we see that in practice. But on the other hand, yeah, it could have been. If enough of the American people had insisted, there would have been nothing that established power could have possibly done to stop them. And yet it only caught on so far. And peace and freedom and free market economics, there's only so many people who are willing to put, a positive reaction and an understanding of that over previous partisan loyalties and that kind of thing. After all, there are a lot of anti-war liberals and progressives and so forth who just could never vote for a Republican in any way ever, just because that's how they feel about it. So even if they knew, for example, that, hey, Obama doesn't have a primary challenger in 2012 at all. So they could have, the anti-war forces on the left could have all voted Republican just to help Ron if they wanted to. It would have been better if they'd been kind of quiet about it. But no, they didn't do that. They just didn't vote, or they voted in their local primary at all. But they could have supported an anti-war guy, at least, so that Obama would be running against an anti-war Republican, trying to attack him from the left and forcing him to be better on war, which they presumably would want. But asking them to do such a thing is a bridge too far. It's 10 bridges too far. So here we are. We got 8 years of war out of Obama. He said he was going to withdraw the troops. Just as I said in my article for antiwar.com in 2009, this guy's going to pull the troops out and send them right back again. And we'll be back in Iraq before he's out of power, which of course was correct. And all he did was expand the wars. The one war he pulled the troops out of, he put them back in. And he left Trump with 7 or 8 or 10, depending on how you count them. And now here we are with Trump, also just like Barack Obama, talks a good game, and one of the wars. Except Pakistan. I guess he only did 1 or 2 drone strikes in Pakistan so far, but otherwise he's escalated all of them.
Well, it does always shock me how you have these people who get into office, and it seems like it's never people who really studied politics in their life. It's people that just knew how to be popular and be likable and managed to get into the public's head. But at the same time, it's like with the American public, I don't think that the majority of the American public would really be able to almost be interested in all of the intricate details that help to shape the picture of what American politics really is. And I think that for a lot of people, it's like they'll watch CNN and they get some news headlines, and that's why they hate Trump. They don't know about the escalation of the wars. They don't know about his Federal Reserve policies or the policies he pushes for with the interest rate hikes cutting the interest rates. And it's like they don't get focused on a lot of that. They listen to the talking heads on the news, and it all becomes very superficial. And I think that's why, like you were saying, Ron Paul would say, just keep teaching people, just keep teaching people. And it's like, that's what I'm here to do. That's what you're here to do. And it's just getting the word out and getting the people who want to understand what's going on, giving them the tools to understand what's going on, so that hopefully in future generations we'll have more people that are highly educated in politics specifically. So when they go to the voting booth, it's not just this blind lever pulling. And I think that's almost one of the toughest parts about Ron Paul's whole campaign, and really most libertarians, is that to be a libertarian, you kind of have to have an idea of why you're a libertarian. It's not like you grow up in a family and it's just like, oh, well, my dad and my grandpa, they were both libertarians. It's like, well, the party hasn't been around, and it's not that well known, like to that degree, to be ingrained in past generations. So it's the kind of thing where I think as the years go on, we'll see more and more people sort of come into the party. But at the same time, just keep putting the information out there that people need to hear. It's like maybe people's ears aren't entirely open to it now, but it doesn't mean that this information is going to go away. It doesn't mean things are going to get less complex, and it doesn't mean that this information won't be needed for future generations.
Right. So is it okay if I talk to you a little bit about Jacob Hornberger, who's running for president as a libertarian right now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So Jacob Hornberger, I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with him. He actually is a really prominent figure in the libertarian movement going way back. I'm not sure how much presence he has, on Facebook and viral kind of discussions of this and that, but he's run the Future Freedom Foundation since 1989, so for 30 years. And he writes an article essentially every day, so you got his take on everything there at his website, or his foundation's website, the Future Freedom Foundation. It's fff.org. And as a libertarian, and he's running again right now. And there's already a movement on. There's an agreement on by a lot of libertarians in the movement to join the party and to try to make the biggest deal possible out of the Hornberger campaign, to make sure that he gets the nomination, and then to make sure to do everything we can to support him as he runs against Trump and whoever the Democrats put up, Warren or whoever it is that they end up settling for, and really causing a riot and having a lot of fun teaching libertarianism to people, in large numbers. And I was brought into the libertarian movement by Harry Brown's campaign in 1996, and I actually never did join the party. But I learned a lot about libertarianism from Harry Brown, from his campaign in 96 and in 2000. And he set such a great example for libertarianism. And it really is true that most Americans don't pay attention to politics at all, except during a presidential election year. And then even then, all they pay attention to is the presidential election, the one that they have the least effect on, of course. But that's what gets the attention. And so the point of it is that, like when you were asking about what we can do to really, kind of move the margin here, and I think that this is a great thing that we can do. And especially if you look at the last campaign of 2016 in hindsight, no offense to Gary Johnson, plenty of offense to Weld, he'll take it. But essentially it was a giant wasted opportunity. Essentially we might as well not have run anyone for president in 2016. Whereas if we run a really good libertarian, a good radical minarchist libertarian like Jacob Hornberger, who is a constitutionalist but who is really against all of America's, well as, dedicated to plumb line libertarian principle, but also, intelligent and well-informed and up-to-date on every kind of current event and policy going on, that with somebody like him in 2016, I think we could have really caused a ruckus and had a lot of fun. And I think that that can definitely happen this time. And, we still have a year. Well, yeah, half a year until the convention. And then we have a year, all the way speaking till, the general election. And so, Tom Woods and Dave Smith and, some other podcast hosts and radio hosts and people, Ernie Hancock out in Arizona, and, thankfully not just a lot of new people, the Mises caucus of the Libertarian Party, they seem to be on board, at least unofficially. I'm not sure exactly how that works. But a lot of the old guard, they all know and love Hornberger too. He really is absolutely great on everything. And so I think he should be able to run a really strong campaign and should have a good chance of getting the nomination. But I think it's the kind of thing, the party is dominated now by people who really think it's really smart to run just kind of a leftover, warmed over Republican politician who doesn't really understand libertarianism, but has kind of a famous name and maybe can raise some money and get some media attention, but not really advance libertarianism in the country. And they're putting their cart before their horse really big time, I think. And so we really need people who are good libertarians, the kind of people who participated in the Ron Paul Revolution, were excited by the Ron Paul Revolution, to take part in this one and see if we can really come together to make a movement out of the effort to elect Jacob Hornberger. And that requires people joining the Libertarian Party if they're not members. It requires them finding out the rules if they have to join their state party, what they have to do to join it, who they need to call to find out all the information, where do they have to go, what are the deadlines in order to get each other elected delegates. It's not just about joining the party and sitting on Facebook and watching. You got to bring your wives and your girlfriends and your best friends and your father-in-law and go down there and elect each other to delegate chairs, delegate spots at your state conventions, so that you can go to the national convention in May here in Austin in May, and we can make sure that our guy gets the nomination and is in the best position to, create a real havoc inside the American political system next year and teach libertarianism, real libertarianism that you can be confident in, that you can swear by to the American public at large, the 330 million of them who frankly have never had the opportunity to hear this case made, at least not since 2012. So asking everybody to do whatever it is that you can. JacobForLiberty.com is Jacob's website, and I don't officially work for him, but I'm very much behind him here. JacobForLiberty.com is the website to find out about it. And then for people who are joining the LP, I haven't gotten around to making my link yet, so I'll direct everybody to tomwoods.com/LP. And if you go to tomwoods.com/LP and you join up from there, then that means that they'll see that too, that this flood of people are coming in, and they're coming in by way of Tom's site. And so that should make an impression. But again, it's not a hostile takeover of the party. It's the libertarian movement joining the party just to do the right thing and elect the guy that they should all prefer anyway, because he's so dang good. And that's the deal. So that's how I really feel about it. And I'm really on, any other, leaders in the movement, any other content producers out there, writers and podcast hosts, and whoever has an audience in our movement. I think it's up to us. And if we all work hard and do all we can to get our audiences on board, we have full, very effective force multipliers to, really make this thing happen. And I can't think of anything more important. And you know what? Look, I'm being redundant here from other interviews I've given and stuff, but I think it's an important point that, hey, it's only November 2019 right now. It's not a year later in 2021, looking back in hindsight and regretting what we didn't do. We have a year to wage the Jacob Hornberger revolution and to get his name out there and make it synonymous with real libertarianism and let the American people have the opportunity to hear what we have to say. And after all, we do have the best solutions for the wars and for, whoever you are, if you're a liberal or a conservative or anybody in America. Our answers are so good, they ought to appeal to everybody. They ought to be agreeable to the left and the right, broadly speaking, that this is what we're going to do. We're going to stop fighting the wars. That's what's going to cause the terrorism to dry up, actually, in the first place. Sounds right. We're going to institute a free market in medicine, and that is going to make the prices plummet so that you won't need socialism to pay your health care bills. You'll be able to take care of them yourselves when we abolish this crony capitalist system. And on down the line. Obviously the Federal Reserve, guns and immigration and every other thing. We're going to get government out of the business of regulating all these things and making matters worse for all sides. And ain't that great? I mean, remember the excitement of the Ron Paul revolution? Oh, Ron's on Wolf Blitzer again. What's he saying? End the wars. Yay. Every day, how exciting that was. And hell, remember all the friends that you still have that you made during that time. Libertarians are a fun group of people to hang out with. Almost all of y'all, I'm not particularly one, but almost all of y'all like drinking beer and hanging out and having fun together and whatever. So what a good time. We can call it a barbecue for the next year, all in support of Hornberger. And we can have a great time doing it too. And so how do you like that?
Well, that was a great plug. And I think that really it's like the Libertarian Party is up against, I mean, other than the obvious pieces here, the Libertarian Party, I think even from like an intellectual standpoint, is up against much more than either of the two major parties, because you have to think like one of the primal survival instincts is that people respond more to negatives than to positives. And so you have these libertarians who talk about, removing power from the government and shouldering that responsibility back on the people. But so many people, I mean, this is one of the propagandistic elements of big government, is that, and you see this even in higher education, where they've gotten so many people to think that when something goes wrong, you blame capitalism. When something goes right, you give credit to the government, and the government fixes the problems of capitalism. And it's like it's almost like the people have to get into the mindset of taking this responsibility on themselves to put their money where they want to put it, to take responsibility for what's going on in their own life, and to not be able to just end another person's life by pulling a lever, or to steal from somebody else by pulling a lever. And I think that that's the big hurdle to get over, is to get people to see that you don't need government to have a fulfilled life. It's like that's something that you should be bringing on yourself. And I think that with the number of people that turn towards government, it just it compounds the dysfunction in people, because they develop these dysfunctional instincts, and then it gets passed on to their children, and then that gets passed on to their children, and before you know it, you have an entire society that thinks that you need government to quell fear. And that's a deep appendectomy to get rid of that in people.
Yeah. Well, and it's true too that this applies just as much to the rich right wing too. That, as we talked about before with businesses on the military dole, once you decide that the Pentagon is your customer, man, it's a wild and scary free market out there. I don't think I want to mess with that at all. In fact, this is part of the story of Lockheed Martin, was that they had invented this plane back in the 70s that they had spent $2 or $3 billion developing, and then nobody wanted it. And everybody bought up the DC-3 and the whatever it was instead, 737s from Boeing, and nobody wanted the Lockheed plane. And they said, we're just never doing this again. We spent all this money developing this thing, and we take this giant risk in the market, and we get nothing out of it. And they made a decision right then that the Pentagon would be their only customer from now on. And then they decided, in fact, that, what we should do? We should work real hard on coming up with, funding the think tanks that write the policies so that we'll know what weapons to make because we'll be the ones prescribing the policy. So we'll know whether we need weapons that are, made for desert warfare versus fighting in Eastern Europe or this kind of thing by hijacking control over the policy itself. And the whole thing, as the military calls it, it's a self-licking ice cream cone. And the same thing goes for, on the local level and the state level and all the way up and down. When there's so many opportunities for companies to get, special subsidies and incentives to do this, that, and the other thing at other people's expense. In fact, there's this great new book called The Israel Lobby Enters State Government, about how the Israelis have set up essentially the Virginia version of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, but it's a government department. It's a government agency now. And their whole game, they're like a chamber of commerce for Israel in Virginia, getting Israeli companies on the Virginia government's dole in order to drive Virginians out of business. And this is just how the game is played, right? They're not cheating. They're playing the game of how to get business done in Virginia. That's how you get business done in Virginia. And even if you're a foreign government.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know about that. It's definitely something that I should probably look more into. But...
yeah, it's a brand new book out by Grant Smith. It's called The Israel Lobby Enters State Government.
Oh.
It's the Virginia Israel Advisory Board is the subject at issue there.
Well, I'll see if I can.
I'll have an interview of him on my show by next week about it. I promise.
Oh, beautiful. Well,
I'm just about halfway through it now.
Nice. I'll link your channel down below in the description. If I can find the book online, I'll link that down below too. So
great. Yeah.
Thank you so much for spending time here today talking to me, Scott. Is there anything else that you want to say? Any social media to plug? Anything like that?
Sure. Well, so I've done 5,000 interviews. You can find them all and sign up for the podcast feed at scotthorton.org. And I'm the editorial director of antiwar.com, and you can find some recent articles there. I wrote a book called Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, which some people liked, including Ron Paul. And there's an audiobook version of that if you're interested in that. And then I don't know if you can see the writing depending on the quality here. The white book in the background there is my brand new one, The Great Ron Paul, The Scott Horton Show Interviews from 2004 to 2019. And that's the transcripts of 39 interviews of Dr. Paul that I've done, and also a speech that I gave a year ago about how much I love the guy. And so that's that, the great Ron Paul. And then I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute. and that's at libertarianinstitute.org, and that's me and the great Sheldon Richman and Pete Quinones, who you might know from Twitter as Mance Raider there. He's our managing director, and that's libertarianinstitute.org, and I'm pretty sure that's everything, bud.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Scott. I greatly appreciate this.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it too.